I came across this series of events, I think earlier in the year, and I've been in contact with Melanie Marie at BCU, and I got in touch and I was like, would you like to hear about this? And she said, sure, it'd be probably a good addition. So this session's called Actions for Decolonizing HE in the UK. And it's a systematic narrative review of empirical research that I've recently completed as part of my doctorate in education. That's why, as you can see, I put Glasgow and Strathclyde. I work at Glasgow University. I recently had a full-time post. I have now a kind of a fractional post, and I studied my doctorate in education at Strathclyde. Okay, so about me, my positionality, because positionality is a key part of decolonial thinking and decolonial theorizing as well. I'm originally from a binational family from the suburbs of Texas, of Dallas, Texas, I should say. I'm currently probably a binational or trinational. I say that because I'm originally from the US, but my dad is from Iran, but I don't hold that citizenship, although legally I probably do, because of the way citizenship is passed from father to children. And I've been in the UK since on and off since 2009. I did a master's here years ago, and then I came back and became a citizen 2 or 3 years ago. My background is a student of languages and culture, so Russian and Spanish, and that later led me into teaching EFL, English as a foreign language, which then led me to teaching academic writing, working as a learning developer, so someone who helps learners to develop their academic literacies, or some people like to call it study skills. And throughout all that work, I also was interested in learning technologies, which led me to kind of into leading academics and creating curricula for blended and online learning. And more recently, I've supervised master students in education. Also, I study a doctorate in education part-time at Strathclyde. I'm self-funded, so I'm doing it through what's called a doctoral loan. And until recently, I co-led the University of Glasgow Decolonizing the Curriculum Community of Practice. Why is this all important? Because setting out your positionality, and there's probably a couple other aspects I could have added. I have ADHD, for example, so I'm neurodiverse. A couple of other aspects that you can add and why you should set this out is because it helps frame how you're approaching your learning and teaching, the subject you're teaching, and if you're getting into decolonization, it helps to frame not only how you view the knowledge, but also your position in relation to the knowledge that you are kind of imparting or teaching to other students. Okay, so a brief overview. What I've done is we have an hour and a half, but we could take up to an hour, or we could use the full hour and a half. I know that an hour and a half is a long time to set a computer, so I was going to give a choice to you. And you can put that in the chat. So the first question to you is, what would you like to find out? I've already prepared a presentation where I touch on the main key findings or key takeaways, the research questions, and I'll take you through the literature strategy, which is very technical, and then the themes and thematic analysis. But it would be interesting to know ahead of time, kind of, what would you like to find out? And even your motivations for coming, because that can help me focus some of what I will say or what I can say. So if you want to take a moment to just put that in the chat, or even if you want to unmute yourself and say what you hope to achieve or what you hope to find out, that would be really helpful to me. The reason I'm asking is not only because there's a lot to go through, but also because I know from the other side, it can be hard to be talked at. So for quite a long time. So this is part of me wearing my educator's hat and trying to make it more engaging, giving you a choice, so to speak, and where we could go. Okay, so Sean has said, I'm relatively new to the field, so I'm interested in learning more, no specifics. Okay, fair enough. Jody says, I'm hoping to find out about what has worked for others in approaching decolonization, particularly in convincing some people that it's necessary. Okay, that's a fair question and very important. Kat, how to take theory into practice. We'll try. That's always a contention across any field, I think. But we'll try and touch on that as well. Yes, the Holy Grail. Okay. And Dinah, I would like a better understanding of the challenges with decolonizing the curriculum and the ways it can be achieved, especially because my role is more staff-facing. But I realize there is a lack of engagement between EDI practitioners and the students. And yes, you're probably exactly right, Dinah. There's this weird dichotomy which stems from coloniality of divisions of labor, divisions of bodies. You know, you have professional services, and then you have academic services, and then if you're at a place like Glasgow, you have technical staff, and of course research staff as well, people only on research contracts. So yeah, there's kind of a division of different labor that happens. I see Saeed has also joined. If you want to just say hello, where you're from in the chat and what you're hoping to achieve. But what I'll do, I'll start. The downside of using Teams, probably the same with Zoom, is I cannot always see the chat. So if you have a question, just raise your hand or unmute, and then that will get my attention. So I'll go ahead and start then. The first thing, the research questions. For doing a systematic review or systematic narrative review, you have to have a research question because it helps you to focus on what you're going to look at. So these were the questions I was looking at. The overarching one was, what does research in the UK demonstrate regarding practical actions for doing this? And I was focused specifically on HE, so specifically on universities. I didn't look at colleges, I didn't look at schools, and I only looked at any published literature focused on the UK context. The three kind of questions that I guess maybe naturally arised out of this was, how do studies define decolonization? Because that's very important, because it tells us how they frame it and how they frame their research and their work. What were the actions or interventions that they kind of did, or what came out of it, and also what the challenges or barriers. By the way, if I seem tired, I am very tired. I'm having my bathroom ripped out and a new one put in. So every day I have to go up to Strathclyde and wake up, essentially. But today I've decided to stay home. Okay, key takeaways, reflections. These are a mixture of takeaways, but also my reflections on the whole process. So as I read, I think it was up to 18, 20 papers. I ended up 18 or 20 papers, I ended up distilling. One big thing I realized, and I kind of knew this, but I realized it as well through the reading, is decolonization work will start with diversification. And a lot of the research is on the diversification part, what they're actually doing, but it can't end there. Another thing, very important, especially if you're new to this, decolonization and diversification are not the same thing, right? Diversification is a step or a series of steps towards decolonization. So this is a very long-term process, which I'll touch upon in a bit. And by the way, do feel free to ask questions or note down questions, because I might forget to make certain connections. I have ADHD. That's my throwaway card, get out of jail card. They make sense in my head, but not normally. Positionality, I think, is key to decolonial work, but not all researchers did this in their own work. So for example, STEM research, they seem to avoid this, perhaps because talking about themselves it goes against the academic norms in STEM, right, broadly. It goes against the epistemological and ontological kind of foundations of how science is done, really, in those areas. You don't put yourself in the research. I know that's a broad general statement because qualitative research in STEM does happen, and inevitably the researcher will be present in the research, depending on what framework they're doing, who they're researching, what purpose, why, so on and so forth. The scope for some of the research looked at, again, representation, which relates to diversification. Again, a step to decolonization, a step towards decoloniality. So representation is like increasing the number of women in your reading lists, increasing the number of Black, brown, non-white people in your reading lists. That's all representation, looking at representation. And again, it is a valid thing, but it's important to kind of use the terminology to what it means. So decoloniality is something different compared to diversification and representation. In some of the research that I read, especially in non-STEM, so social sciences, arts and humanities, others, there was a lot of references to critical theories and critical pedagogy. So if you know your bell hooks or Paulo Freire or your German critical school theorists and who they all affected, a lot of them tended to inform the research in, again, social sciences, arts and humanities, and anything that was generally non-STEM. That's more of an observation. It doesn't mean that that's right or wrong, but decolonial thinking tends to be informed by a mixture of different theories, and the critical pedagogies, critical school is one of them. They tend to inform a lot. As far as areas of focus and methods, what people were doing, there was a lot of what I called documentation analyses of reading lists. So a lot of the research I looked at, people were going through the reading lists, and in various ways, depending upon their subject, again, they would do analyses of those reading lists. They would try and count how many people were women, non-white, so on and so forth. So you ended up with these statistical analyses of like what they were doing, or what there was rather, so that they could see what they could change. And related were audits of course descriptors, whether locally or nationally. So some of the research would look at course descriptors to see what were the subjects they were touching on, but also what was perhaps the reading lists, if anything, they could look at to glean. This was probably more important or more prominent in things like politics, economics, and again, the social sciences, because those subjects, especially economics, tend to have a very small set of canon, so to speak, knowledge that they draw on. And you won't see marginalized names generally in those areas. Especially economics. Economics is very unique. They have a very rigid paradigm. They're not very flexible. And this is coming from the research itself. Generally, there was overall very little focuses on decolonizing the curriculum and education. So again, I was able to get about 18 to 20 papers, and that's going down from about 200 or so, which I'll touch upon later. Reflecting upon what I did, thematic analysis is it can be an interesting, insightful way of doing things, but it does take a while. And ideally, it would be done with 2 or 3 co-researchers. So when you have a team, it can help validate your findings a lot more, but also it's spreading the labor. It can be quite time consuming. Subject librarians are your friends for this type of their effective literature searches. If you've never done a systematic review, we'll touch upon that today. Systematic reviews are very popular, highly popular in medicine, in the medical sciences and science generally. They're starting to become a bit more prominent in social sciences, education, so on and so forth, but less so. Um, but they're a good way of looking at a particular set of research questions to see what there is at the moment. And let's see. Okay, moving on to the next one. STEM research. One thing that I did find was out of all the STEM papers, they kept referring back to one particular paper, this Shukan Bird and Pittman. That was a good paper. The only issue I had with it was they were referring to that one as if that's the gold standard, and they weren't kind of breaking their own ground, if that makes sense. That's just a small critique. It's not to say that they shouldn't do that or that's the wrong way. It's just that that's something I picked up on, that the STEM papers, which are, I think, dental education, um, dentistry, there was a couple of others, they tended to refer back to this particular paper for a lot of what they were doing. Also, subjects did appear, not always, but to stick within their usual methodological approaches. So arts and humanities did more qualitative stuff, um, and some quantitative, but then STEM did a bit, well, they tended to focus more on the quantitative methods, or sometimes mixed methods. Um, and there were various reasons for that. Again, there was an academic who wrote about politics and economics because those are often taught together, or they're considered allied subjects, I suppose. Um, so one thing I noticed in that respect was they probably used quantitative methods because that's what economics speaks. But they also mixed it in with qualitative because to understand some of what's going on, it's appropriate to take that qualitative measure rather than just looking at the quantitative, especially if you're looking at decolonizing things like economics. There's a lot more work to be done, right? There's a huge gap in the literature, so to speak. So again, I only found about 18 papers in total. So that shows you, and that's in the UK, that shows you that it's a very small number of papers that are out there. Um, and ultimately, yeah, I'll just go on. So how did I do this? I searched various databases, which I have on the next slide. I'll just quickly flip over. These are the databases I looked at. Some of them were platforms, some were databases. This is very important to kind of understand because a database is looking at, a platform is like a huge database. It's like a super database. So you have your Scopus, your directory of open online access journals, Web of Science, those kind of things, right? But then I also looked at specific databases. So here's what I did. This is actually the technical part. This is either the most interesting part for you or maybe one of the more boring parts. If you've never done this before, I would highly recommend going to a subject librarian because they can really help you break it down, because this is a very technical process that you can easily mess up. The first string, I looked for variations of decolonization, well, decolon, right, in the title or in the abstract. The next string, because I was focused on higher education, I used those terms. So higher education, college, university, post-secondary, tertiary, so on and so forth. Again, title and abstract only. Then I combined those two to see what it resulted in. Now, I just realized I don't have the numbers to show you, but I can share the preprint of the systematic review I did, and it is in the paper. The next stage, again, focusing only on the UK, I looked for variations of UK, which were, as you can see, quite large. I then combined those two strings together, so the first and the second, with then the country to see what was there. Okay, the last one, I looked for variations of curriculum, action, so actions, curriculum, curricula, praxis, praxis as well, or intervention. Again, very broad netcast. And again, only looking at the titles and the abstracts. And I'll tell you why I only looked at those two. If I looked at the full text, it would invariably throw up results that were irrelevant, because someone might have referenced something in the references which had to do with decolonizing, or any one of these other words. So as a result, there was a lot of papers that were irrelevant that I had to just cast out, because I was like, no, this has nothing to do with this. The last few steps, I combine the first two set of strings with search string 6 to see what that would do. And if I remember correctly, the results that it threw up were not really helpful. So as a result, I ended up combining, let's see, the context, so the geographic context, search string 4, with search string 7, which was a combination of those others. Okay. I probably haven't explained that very well because it's very technical. I'm a numbers person or a math guy. And to me, this is that kind of logic where I can get lost very easily. But what I will say is, this is what it resulted in. Now, what I found was a lot of these ended up being duplicates, or yeah, a lot of these ended up being duplicates. So I ended up casting out quite a lot. Here's actually what I ended up finding. So there was about 290 papers from 7 databases, 4 platforms. Of those, there was 114 duplicates, which I had to remove. That led to 160-ish papers that I ended up screening by title and abstract. And from that, I ended up excluding about 114 for various reasons. Let's see, I ended up with 47, and then again, whittled those down again, either by topic, study method, or country. So if the topic wasn't relevant, so if it wasn't focused on decolonizing the curriculum or education within HE, I didn't want to look at it. I didn't look at it. The study method, what I mean by that is, if it was just a reflection on practice, I didn't look at it. Now, that said, in further research, I would include that, because reflections on practice, I think, are equally valid. But for the purposes of this systematic narrative review, I looked for papers that mainly had a methods or methodology section, if that makes sense. And I cast the net quite widely, so it didn't matter which subject it was from, because this area is so new. I wanted to see what everyone was saying. And again, as I say here, if it was a conceptual paper focused on reflections on practice, I didn't include that. If it was a book chapter, policy papers, and manifesto statements, again, I didn't include those either. But there is, if you want to know more about decoloniality, there's a lot to learn from those. Maybe less so in policy papers, but definitely from the book chapters, manifesto statements, and so on and so forth, and reflections on practices as well. These are the papers that I analyzed, and again, I'll share this with you later. Actually, I'll just go back so you can have a quick look at that. It's a broad spread. So there are papers from, as you can see, journalism, politics, and economics. So these are a spread of different papers. And on the next slide, I'll actually show you the different subjects, but these are just the titles, so you can actually see where they're from or what they are. I'll share this with you as well. It is in the paper. So again, this is the spread of papers. So different parts of the university, UK, sorry. Different subjects. As you can see, there's allied health professions, dental education, genetics, methodology, public health. Those are all STEM. Various aspects of social sciences ranging from education to politics. And then, of course, arts and humanities, so information literacy, and so on and so forth. So what I did was I used thematic analysis by Brown and Clark. They have quite a lot of resources and information. They have a great book and lots of journal articles and examples about how to do this. So what I did was, from the text that I read, there was about 18 texts. I read them each twice to kind of understand what they were saying. And then I went through and coded, potentially relevant texts after reading them. So I didn't have any predetermined codes. I first read them to kind of see what they were all saying. I took notes and made notes for myself, and then went back and reread them, essentially. This was a subjective and also situated process, so I was very much part of the research in many ways, not only as an educator and a researcher who kind of works in this area, but also trying to learn from what others are saying. So I took a constructionist perspective in doing the kind of thematic analysis, and what this means is creating meaning from what is being said through the codes, if that makes sense. I used in vivo for 2020 for Mac, and again, I coded and then redefined codes iteratively through kind of rereading the texts. As far as the constructionist perspective, what that does is it recognizes my role as a researcher engaged in understanding meaning from across the disciplines that then undertook this systematic review, right? And that particular perspective works well with decolonial thinking because it acknowledges that working together and connecting with others to create knowledge is for the benefit of all. That's from Amadan and Sotesi. I can't see what that says. And the way I kind of established credibility, so to speak, is I was trying to use a mixture of what's called thick description, crystallization, multivocality. Thick description, if you've not done qualitative research, it entails demonstrating the complexities of data while considering tacit knowledge of the hidden assumptions within the data. Crystallization concerns drawing on multiple data sources, which I do by drawing on empirical research from across the disciplines, as these are rooted in various epistemological traditions and theoretical frameworks that don't always draw upon one another, even within decolonial studies. So in a sense, using a range of different papers and perspectives represents that multivocality. Right, so theme one, understandings of decolonization. The main themes that came out of this, or sub-themes if you want to call that, were that challenging hegemony enables, part of decolonization is challenging hegemony that enables the marginalization. So that's one of the things. Context does matter. And decolonization is also a process, a longer term process. I'm just going to show you a quote. So this is a quote from the paper. If you want to just take a moment to read that so that I'm not reading it for you, because this kind of lays out a definition, one definition of what decolonization is. So again, this is one definition based upon almost an amalgamation of not only literature that's out there apart from these, but also what generally these papers were saying. What I haven't said here is more radical moves for reimagining, well, more radical moves for decolonization might be totally reimagining the idea of universities altogether, because in their current form, they remain sites of either production or reproduction of colonial systems and structures that privilege dominant groups, and thinking that some believe cannot be undone without fundamental change. So there's different ways of viewing what, of understanding what decolonization could mean. But at its essence, in higher education, it's challenging dominant epistemologies and ontologies while raising up knowledges and systems that have been marginalized, invalidated, excluded, so on and so forth. What that means is we're not replacing the canon. We are, if anything, augmenting it if that makes sense. So we're not getting rid of knowledge that's already there, unless it's problematic, right? One example is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? This is a very popular thing in the social sciences. I don't know if it's very popular in STEM. I can't remember, to be honest, but it's often referred to in things like leadership, um, resilience, all this kind of stuff. But actually, it's very problematic because Maslow went to an Indian reservation and he observed them to create his hierarchy of needs, but he never referenced who they were, right? He never talked about them. Okay, so actually, he effectively extracted knowledge through his observations of this particular Indian culture. It was in North America. I think it was either in Canada or the US. I can't remember. I could send you a link after. But we often talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how it's so great and wonderful. It's also been debunked, but it's problematic because it's attributed to one person, but it wasn't his idea. He took it through observation of a different culture, effectively, and he didn't appropriately attribute these ideas to them, to indigenous culture. So that's one reason why we say we don't necessarily want to get rid of the canon as it is, but we want to raise up knowledges that have been excluded, hidden, erased, so on and so forth. I hope that makes sense. Because one misconception of decolonization is it means we want to get rid of Aristotle. It's like, no, we don't want to get rid of Aristotle, right? And Aristotle is very popular in like education, philosophy, but the problem with Aristotle is he owned slaves. He was a slave owner. He didn't have particularly great views on women because of how ancient Greek society was structured. In addition, if we only, let's take an education lens, right? If you study education, or if you do a PG CAP, postgraduate certificate in African practice as part of your teaching contract or something at a university, if they touch on a topic like critical reflection on professional practice, usually what will happen is you will start with Aristotle, and then you'll jump ahead to maybe Vygotsky, but probably Dewey, John Dewey, who was an American progressive educator. And then you might jump ahead to someone else called Stephen Brookfield. Now, the problem with that is they're all men. They're all based in more or less the Western European kind of way of knowing and thinking. And we don't know about other knowledges. How do other knowledges and ways of living and being, other cultures effectively, how do they view things like reflection, critical reflection? They do have views on them, but we don't often hear about them. We just hear about Aristotle and his conception of philosophy and all this kind of stuff. Now that comes from my own studies of education. I distinctly remember we started with Aristotle, but it's like, well, what about thinkers from Indian culture, from indigenous cultures, from Chinese culture, right? Others, African cultures. There are thinkers, but we don't know about them. Okay. And actually, recently, a colleague had an anecdote about how there was a plant in South Africa which has medicinal properties, which was owned by a German company. A plant, right? Ultimately, the locals fought for and got the rights to this plant back. But again, this is why decolonization is important. This is one of many reasons. So context matters. Context is also a problem. A lot of the papers I reviewed didn't explicitly mention context, but context is inherently intertwined and important for understanding decolonial thinking and practices, how they're understood and enacted. One of the papers did note, though, that, decolonization of, say, curricula should be viewed as an approach which is contextual to different disciplines and subject areas. However, I suppose the problem with this is One part of decolonial thinking and decolonization is going beyond your subject area, your subject canon, to draw on other canons as well, other areas of knowledge, to, again, this idea of relationality, to understand what you're doing, what's missing, okay, and why things are missing. So again, the STEM subjects, they tend to employ these quantitative methods and only occasionally mixed methods, right, with qualitative approaches. This, and equally, I won't like harp on STEM, equally, arts and humanities and social sciences also, they tended to employ qualitative approaches. So they tended to stick within their kind of comfort area, so to speak. But this is why context is perhaps not only something to consider, but also a problem. Because yes, context is important, but also breaking out of that context is also important, especially if you want to understand, pursue, enact decolonial kind of thinking and practices. So decolonial thinking calls for critically examining the context in which subjects initially arose. So this is one thing that's very important, is situating socio-historically the knowledge that informs your subject area. Okay. Why? Because what happens is, if we do not interrogate this, then we don't understand why things are taken for granted. Okay. You have to interrogate why certain things are considered universal. You know, it's just been done that way forever, right? But why? Why has it been done that way? How did we get to that point? Okay. There was this thing called the Enlightenment, and some people refer back to that, but the Enlightenment was preceded by colonialism, which led to coloniality. Okay, systems of colonial structures maintaining kind of power and order over certain other people, while elevating certain other people, which were generally white European people, at the expense of others. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the Maslow example. I'm sure there are other examples. I know that there was one from Brazil. The government, I think it was in the 1800s, if not, I'm pretty sure it's the 1800s, if not the 1900s. They wanted to eradicate malaria. And this is anecdotal. It is research, though. You need to go and find it. From what I remember, it was at the expense of not only local indigenous, but also Black populations that they were able to eradicate it. But quite a lot of people died as a result. But it's often not talked about, right? How this came into being, at what cost, basically. Okay. And again, going back to Aristotle, who he was, what his views were on many people, not just on philosophy. It's looking at that and taking all of your greats. So Kant, for example, looking at his views globally, because he did have particular views, I believe, on race as well. So again, it's a long transformative process. It requires critical interrogation of what's currently accepted, materially and structurally. And again, it's a very long process that involves understanding not only marginalization, how it happens, what it looks like, but also how this was caused by colonialism, and how what's called the colonial power matrix, which still exists, maintains things as they are. I can talk to you a bit about more what the colonial power matrix is, because later, if you wish, decolonization is a long-term process. Again, as I said earlier, diversification is a step or series of steps. Increasing representation is also part of this process, naturally. It has to be. And one thing I would like to say is decolonization cannot be done over a semester or a year. So if you ever see a paper or a presentation that says, I have decolonized my X, no, they haven't, right? That's not true. Okay, they've started it, they've taken steps to do it, but they have not decolonized. Okay, that's not to say that the work isn't good, but I have seen over the last 2 or 3 years a lot of talks that would say decolonized, and this is where language becomes important. Decolonization, decolonizing, people are probably doing that, but no one has or can in the next, few years say that they have decolonized, unless they probably totally, wholly restructure a program or create a program from scratch, which is probably a lot more difficult. So in sum, it's a process that requires time, reflection, and critical reflection, and also probably context-specific approaches while drawing on decolonial thinking. And I would also say drawing on other subjects as well, not staying in your own comfort zone of your own canon, but drawing more widely and more broadly. The main thing here that I was able to understand was power relations, collaboration, disparities, and also actions resulting from research. Just very quickly, power relations. This is the next slide you should see. Staff, on the whole, generally report good practices being implemented, while students frequently report the opposite. So they still highlight gaps in the provision. And this comes from, for example, minority ethnic student views often contrasting with staff views regarding to the extent to which curricula appears diverse, inclusive, and representative. So there's a disparity still, and this arises from the research. Staff will think they're doing the right things, but students are like, no, more can be done. Okay. Another key area that was throughout the papers, not all of them, but there were some that were very on the nose. Several authors noted that the need to address opposition to change is very important because it can be a discomforting process, especially for people who don't know about it. But it can also be discomforting, especially for those who are very set in their epistemological and ontological ways of thinking, knowing, and being. Okay. So if they only know their subject and they believe their subject is, for example, free from bias, so on and so forth, it can be difficult to address that change, okay, to broach that change with them. Now, this, I would say, is where you would have to go back to the question of what is knowledge, who created it, okay, accepted knowledge, I mean, and why did we get where we are now, okay? I know I've watered that down a bit. That probably doesn't make sense, but it goes back to the fundamental question of why is certain knowledge valid and why do we just accept it? So it's about questioning that, for example, rather than just accepting it as it is. Okay. For example, okay, controversial, maybe the scientific method, interrogating it. Why do we do it that way? But going deeper, okay, if you think about it, the scientific method has been there like that in that form for quite a long time. And what that does is there's ripples. If you look at the structure of a research paper, you'll get a typical IMRAD approach. So introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion, something like that. This is a very watered down example, but it's about looking at something critically and seeing why is it like that, but then what does it affect? Okay. Because if you look at some journals, if you don't have an IMRAD paper, they will not accept your paper. If you, heaven forbid, you use the word I in your paper, they will definitely not accept your paper. But this goes back to how knowledge is viewed and power relations again. So decolonial thinking sees knowledge as the way knowledge is accepted as it is it's constructed in a way that is objective, which means, and I'm talking about academic knowledge, not knowledge generally, right? We cannot use I. That's in some canons, in some knowledge areas, some subjects, you cannot use I because it's seen to be that you're not being objective. So you have to use a third person. But if you think about the third person, like research has found, or this research shows, or that kind of language, what you're doing is you're disembodying it. It's like, who's done the research? Okay. And the other issue with that is it creates an objective, almost God eye view of what you're trying to say. Okay, God has, this study has found. But there's a problem with that, is because it's decontextualized. and again, I'm watering this down because we don't have very long. It's decontextualized, but it's also made objective in a way that is, some would argue, is false. Okay. Because some would argue that the researcher cannot disentangle themselves from the research. Sure, you can account for biases, you can say you account for biases, but still, you are the researcher, the academic, and you do have a very close involvement in the research that you're doing. This relates to power relations as well. I won't go into that too much, but from these papers, if you want to do any decolonial work with students, you do have to unpack these power relationships, because students will naturally look to an academic, a teacher, whatever, and think you have all the answers. But if any of us who've been working in education for a long time, we know we don't have all the answers, okay? We don't. That's why we're in education, because we're researching, we're exploring, we're generally open to learning more. But in terms of doing decolonial work that's collaborative, this is where things get troublesome, because students will naturally, or can, not always, look to educators that they're working with as, you have the power, you have the knowledge, so let's lead. So you lead, basically. One paper noted the development of assessment items to include diverse patient representations. I think this was from dental education, if not something else. That was key because a lot of the representations in that particular assessment and in probably the course materials had focused on primarily white Europeans, right? If you think about medicine, dentistry, and you think about the populations in either the UK or elsewhere, not everyone is the same. So for them, this was particularly important to change that, to show that, look, things might look differently across across different populations. Also, others highlighted changes to assessment design, where they actually had students engaging with inequalities and marginalized groups. So directly going out and engaging with these groups. I'm sure that must have been a difficult assessment to design, but also get sign off on, because going back to power structures, you often have committees that will sign off on course creation, and they can also be blockers, although I don't remember reading any papers that said that. Perhaps less, well, something that was done more was changes to course and content structure, to try and break with dominant representations of like a subject, but that was met with difficulty, in that I believe it was politics and economics. You have these key voices throughout the years, and those are considered the key voices. So how do you break with those key voices, right? Or how do you elevate a diversity of voices? Okay. Those are some of the authors who touched on that. Another author developed like a subject focus, evidence-based curriculum wheel for decolonizing the curriculum. This was particularly interesting because it actually got taken up higher up and became part of the university academic framework. It'd be interesting to go and engage with that academic to see how did they do that. But one thing that was very important that I don't highlight it here, but they ended up recruiting a permanent research fellow post. And this is probably what is key for anything, for these kind of initiatives. You need to have people in permanent posts doing this, not precarious workers. And again, less common was the creation of wholly new modules. There wasn't a lot of research that talked about this. So again, that's an area for development, is where you're creating wholly new courses, modules that focus on these topics, or that take initiative to integrate these topics in quite actively, because that doesn't really happen. There were other areas that focused on mentoring and training staff because students wanted this, staff felt they needed it. One of them in particular was a kind of monthly workshop on good practices for diversifying reading lists, and also resources allocated towards anti-racist training. Okay, the last one, theme 3, barriers and challenges. There's 3 sub-themes: coloniality of knowledge, barriers of the mind, and resourcing. One example, this is more not from the papers, but from a chat with a colleague. Coloniality of knowledge has a big hold on, again, the different subjects. And what coloniality of knowledge is essentially the systems and structures that keep knowledge as it is in place. Okay. As an example, if you look at your reading lists and you see what's on that reading list and you go back, say, 5 years, 10 years, go back and look at your reading list and see what knowledge has been taught to students. Okay. If you do that, you can then understand what knowledge is privileged and what viewpoints are privileged. So say that you've not had a diversified reading list with a range of different authors. Okay. That will affect how those students think and see the world and view the world. Just as an example, if I was teaching education, I might have bell hooks. She's a critical educator. She's also Black, female. She was. But if that particular author isn't in the reading list, okay, you're taking away that representation and viewpoint, which affects, again, how students think, what they would expect, and how they would see the subject or education as education, for example. So, for example, and the next one is very timely. Eminent scholars informing different areas, they often ignore or overlook issues related to race and racism, with some openly arguing that some races reign supreme over others. Now, you might not hear about that today, right? People won't say that so explicitly. Sometimes they do, but some of the key authors, key voices will say that, and they have said that. I do know of one colleague at another university who, and this is anecdotal, right? I won't name names. There's an esteemed expert, sociological expert on social class. They understand class and its implications for sociology and social policy very well. However, they ignore the intersections of race, gender, racialized gender with respect to class. As a result, by ignoring all those areas, they're marginalizing 3 groups simultaneously. Okay? So this is where the coloniality of knowledge is very important in understanding. It also affects other things. How the traditional lecture can be problematic because it's very top-down. How assessments in some areas, the written assessment, for example, is another way that's very... Sorry, I've not talked this long in quite a long time. How the coloniality of, assessment. So the written assessment, for example, privileges a certain way of knowing and being over, for example, an oral assessment, which might actually be welcomed by or help some students express their ideas more than they could in writing. Excuse me. And in some areas such as arts, humanities, social sciences, other knowledges, indigenous knowledges, they're marginalized for other reasons because they're not considered universal, okay, or objective. All right, I'm going to move on in the interest of time. So barriers of the mind was another sub-theme, which I thought was very important. It came out in economics. There was overt hostility to decolonial moves. Again, this was deeply rooted in the kind of the dominant paradigm of economics, which has a very, very rigid way of thinking, knowing, and being, and researching. Some researchers reported discomfort educators face when talking about these topics because they don't know what they are, right? That they're not experts. And because they're not experts, suddenly the imposter syndrome comes back, okay? But this is where dialogue can be very important, dialoguing with experts locally and nationally and internationally, but also with students to get their understandings. An interesting paper did highlight that some STEM researchers described how their moves led to a type of hostility called what they called epistemic fragility. Now, excuse me, this was a riff on the term white fragility, what happened was when challenged, not challenged, but when presented with the evidence that perhaps their subjects could be more diversified, more representative, um, these STEM researchers effectively backlashed against the researchers by claiming that they were being made out to be racist, which wasn't the point at all, right? The point was to show that um, the way knowledge is presented in courses and reading lists to students is presenting a certain way of knowing and being and thinking that privileges certain people. Okay. That is one of the papers that you can go and read. It was a very interesting paper. In the end, they did publish their research, but they did go through some difficulty in that. And it was quite a heartening read to read because it can show that this work can be risky, but also people can be fragile in understanding how it works. The fragility doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop doing the work. The fragility has to be addressed, right? Also, barriers of the mind, BME, so Black minority ethnic colleagues, are frequently identified as being equipped to lead these things because they are Black minority and ethnic. But that's absolutely not true, and it's absolutely harmful because it shoulders the responsibility to them. They're already marginalized, and as a result, they get landed not only with more work, but they're seen as experts. It's almost, well, it's an assumption that's being made, um, but they may not know about the subject at all. They may not have an interest in it. And more importantly, they may be on precarious contracts, which then means doing this work is already risky enough. It adds more risk to them, more precarity to them. So resourcing issues, overall, supportive, thoughtful leadership can create positive conditions for this, right? You have to have a mixture of bottom up and top down. And if there isn't that strategic resourcing, then these moves will be more difficult to be made. And the strategic resourcing can come top down from the very top of a university or locally, like at a college level. Excuse me. I should have had some mints nearby. Let's see, integrating diversification decolonial moves into practice without considering workloads. This often does happen as well. So workloads, academics are already quite busy or too busy. And as a result, they're being shouldered with, just do this, just add it to your workload. But actually, this needs separate workload. And this needs separate, almost staffing to do it. Okay. Because staff who are already busy asked to take on another thing that they don't know about is going to create quite a tricky situation. And again, this is coming from generally what I've read, that leadership that's meaningfully engaged with these will resource them properly. And as the result of that proper resource, we'll get full-time staff involved who can work on this specifically. Just as an anecdote, again, Glasgow University a few years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they tried to recruit a 0.5 person internal to do this. Nobody went for the role because 0.5 internally seconded. It's like, no, why would you do that? 0.5 is not enough, but also the university, Glasgow itself, is 40,000 students, 10,000 staff. It's quite large. Well, it's a huge university. So for one person to do that on a 0.5 contract was just not doable. Okay. What this means is you should also be wary, or well, be cognizant of what leadership is trying to do when they're recruiting these posts. Okay. Are they wanting full-time, part-time? How many? You probably need a team and a team of champions across colleges. As far as limitations, directions for further inquiry, again, I didn't consider reflections of practice. In hindsight, or well, for further research, I would, because there are valid sites for research. It would be interesting to look at the links between dominant scientific paradigms within subject areas and the methods they use to kind of employ to enact and foster decolonial practices. Because it could kind of show us, well, Okay, you're coming from this background. What methods are you using? Why are you using them? What's the justification? But also, how does that align with what they already know, as opposed to what they don't know? Also looking at the underpinnings of practices that people are doing, and the almost to kind of like, to what extent are they decolonial, if you want to say that? Because decolonial moves can take, again, many flavors. They can be, uh, pragmatic, progressive, or radical, so on and so forth. Another area that you could look into is university policies in the UK, re decolonization, and how these influence the kind of local activists or researchers in this area. And also whether the policies are helping to enact what they preach, or whether they're just there in words alone. Okay. Because as you know, if any of you have worked in HE for a while, you've probably come across policies that are really just words, right? They're not really anything but more than words. Something that I'm interested in is examining communities of practice focused on this. And again, what about other areas? What do professional services think? What are their views? What do research staff think? What are their views as well? I think I've come to the end of it. In the end, I ended up talking at you, which I really did not want to. But please, it's now time for your questions, because I'm realizing that's probably way too much information for an hour and a half session. I was hoping it'd be an hour, but I would love to hear your questions or your concerns or your comments.
Hi. Since there's no other questions, I was thinking about just asking a really sort of a broader question, I suppose. Thank you very much for your talk. I work at the University of Portsmouth, and I've also done a study basically surveying my colleagues and their attitudes towards decolonizing the science curriculum. And it's very, you get very many different kinds of attitudes, right? But one question that a colleague of mine asked me the other day that I couldn't answer, so then I was thinking I could maybe ask you whether you have come across any research on this, is so we talk about how decolonization is meant to sort of increase, belonging and student well-being and all these kind of things. Are there actually any studies that show evidence of an increase in the feelings of belonging amongst marginalized students after we have, done efforts to decolonize the curriculum? Did you come across any studies on that when you did your research?
There will be. However, I didn't in this context. And the reason I didn't, very simply, is because I was looking at decolonization, like if they even mentioned it. But what you're talking about is representation, diversification. So I'm sure there will be studies on about that in that regard, whether increasing that increases belonging, feelings of belonging, so on and so forth. There definitely will be.
Because when I try and read up on these topics, there's a lot of papers that call for, this is what we need to do, and this is going to be great, and this is what students are calling for, and there's all the I suppose all the theoretical background supporting that if we implement all these things, if we do actually successfully decolonize the universities and the curriculum, then all these positive things are going to happen. But it's I suppose it's the empirical evidence of showing that has actually happened. That would be really interesting. And I haven't managed to really find any studies that show that, but then I haven't done a sort of in-depth search. But anyway, maybe there's other people in the audience that have any sort of the thoughts on that.
There's a paper that I've just found. It's called Representation, Belongingness, and Rumination in Underrepresented Psychology Students. That might have some things. You might need to go and even look in, you might even need to look in school level.
Yeah. I found some at sort of primary school level where they talk about where they've actually assayed the students sort of before and after, I think, but not really at sort of higher education level. But I suppose it will come, right? The more we all actually do something about this and start decolonizing our teaching, hopefully these studies will follow.
There's another paper which is called Cultural Stereotypes and a Sense of Belonging Contribute to Gender Gaps in STEM. I haven't looked, again, I'm just looking at these, searching for these as I look.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But that looks hopeful because it looks like it would look at the lay of the land while seeing, well, how does this contribute to to gaps anyway? Because if we think about it, in recent years, they've been wanting to get more girls into STEM. So there must be studies out there that look at, increasing representation in the literature.
Yeah.
Which the problem is it could mean anything from your curriculum in school to representations in actual books. But then there's also the sociological side of, how many films and TV shows do we see where women are scientists or like the one who's doing all the work or whatever. Okay, so this is the issue. There's many different lenses or contexts you could look at. The sociological, the schooling itself, the curriculum, the content of the curriculum. So maybe that would help. I see Jody has just put a paper as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna look up all these papers at the end. I've saved them now. So that was just, I suppose, maybe not super relevant to what I was just thinking.
What would be interesting is to hear any of your immediate reactions, because on reflection, that was very long and it may have been a bit meandering, and I started to struggle halfway through because of my voice. But it would be good to hear any reactions, like what's one or two things that you have learned or you want to learn more about after having heard this kind of session. What I can also do is share. So I don't know if there'll be anything here, but at Glasgow, we have kind of a website. On it. There's something called the Knowledge Hub, and there is a reading resource list, which is kind of community generated. That might also have some food for thought or signposts as well. And there is also, if you're interested in knowing more about this, there's also decolonial dialogues, which I'll be honest, I found out about it recently, but they sound really interesting. And they may actually, I want to maybe say they have vocabulary. I seem to remember something, so that might help you if you're particularly new to it as well. Yeah, that's the problem with this, Sean, is there is a lot of new terminology that you would have to kind of get your head around. It wouldn't take that long. Depends on how much you want to spend on it. But it's to help understand not only the differences in the different areas, but to see what you would really want to do, so that if you do something, you want to talk about it in the right language after. That can be it will be tricky. I mean, it just takes time.
Actually, can I ask another sort of more broader question as well? I sometimes feel like when I talk about these topics in my department or with, sort of higher ups, sort of management teams, they like the ideas of doing all these things, but they don't like the word decolonizing. Do you also get that sort of resistance, or do you feel like at your university there's much more acceptance of the terminology decolonizing the curriculum?
I think it depends on who you're talking to. I know at Glasgow, part of the university learning and teaching strategy, it was built into it, and that would have come from our VP, Vice Principal Learning and Teaching, along with the EDI unit, the ED unit, Equality and Diversity unit. but I have heard that in some areas, yes, people don't like it. They don't understand it. Ironically, within Glasgow, the College of Medical Veterinary and Life Sciences and the LS, they tend to be more open to these things, which is interesting because it's like, okay, the sciencey people are open to it. Why? Why are they interested in it? Whereas I think you'll get the usual suspects like, were there any particular areas where you found that it was more rejected?
Well, I gave a presentation at some point at a sort of faculty, showcase something, and I think it was our dean of education who said, "Oh, this is all great stuff, and well done, but can we just call it something else because people just have bad associations with this word, or people misunderstand it, and it's just in the press it gets a bad rep, right?" And
It,
but I'm really pleased to hear that certain universities are more open to this
in,
terminology.
I think in this case, you would have to, the best idea is spelling out the definition. Okay, there is a misconception that decolonization means ripping up everything and restarting afresh. Okay, but that's not true. That's
Yeah.
what the likes of the Daily Mail wants you to believe.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't replace the word. I mean, I suppose you could try if you wish, but the problem with that is then people are speaking different languages. Okay, and I've seen this happen within the context of generative AI, which is very different. But as an example, the term prompt engineering, I think someone said, could we have a different term because people don't understand that? But then what happens is you end up spending time coming up with terms that are not widely, I'm not going to say universally, but widely accepted or widely known, right?
Yeah.
So I think someone came up with the concept of better input, better output, which is ridiculous, because it's known widely as, prompt engineering or inputting prompts, for lack of a better word. So in this case, I would say contextualizing it is key. Pull up a definition with references that makes it crystal clear what it is, why it's important, because it's not something that you could just come up with a new word with, I guess. So yeah.
Thank you guys for attending. We might have to just wrap it up there.